Oh, hi there, and welcome to StoryStream, the Vancouver Public Library's Storytime for Adults. I'm Jonna, and I'm coming to you today from Level 6 of the Central Library. Now, just like all of our 22 locations across the city, this location is on the unceded homelands of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And we're very humbled to be able to live and work and play on this land. Did you know that not only can you search for books and other resources here at the library, but you can also use it to find the answers to your very own mysteries? That's right. In 2001, legendary author Bernard Cornwell came right here to the Central Library and discovered his very own missing father. Bernard Cornwell was given up for adoption after a torrid love affair between his mother and father ended sourly after the Second World War. It wasn't until the age of 58 when he came to an author event here at the Vancouver Public Library when he mentioned his mysterious lineage and his hopes to find his missing father, of which he was successful. Although Bernard did not use the genealogical resources we have at the Vancouver Public Library to track his heritage, you can search your genealogical roots right here at the library. At every branch, you can access our specialized genealogical software, Ancestry Library Edition, and the Genealogy and Family History Guide on our website, which has information to help you get started with your research, as well as a list of useful resources at the library and online. Level 6 of the Central Library has a genealogy collection with books about notable families' histories, immigration records, census records by area of the country, tips for finding relatives with limited information, and even heraldry. You can subscribe to the Genealogical Resources e-newsletter created by our Information Services Department, which also highlights the most recent information about our collections and resources to help you solve your own mystery. Speaking of mysteries, today we will be treated to a reading of mystery maven Agatha Christie's short story, The Four Suspects, which is featured in her collection, The Tuesday Club Murders. This is where we're first introduced to the iconic character of Miss Marple. Dame Agatha Christie, often referred to as the Queen of Crime, was born in 1890, and over the course of her storied career, she wrote 66 novels and 14 short story collections. She also wrote the world's longest-running play, a personal favorite of mine, The Mousetrap. She was initially unsuccessful with her efforts at writing, but gained acclaim and a following after the publication of her 1920 hit, The Mysterious Affair at Styles. The mysterious Miss Christie puzzled the world herself when she shockingly disappeared from the public eye and went missing for 11 days in 1926. She died at the age of 85, having been awarded the exclusive Edgar Award for mystery writing and having been appointed a dame by Queen Elizabeth II for her contributions to art and culture. Today's story will be read to us by Vancouver's own mystery queen, local business entrepreneur Tanya Bennett. Her game company, Vancouver Mysteries, has staged outdoor mystery adventure games in downtown Vancouver for over 33,000 people and counting. And now has 3 virtual games that can be played from anywhere, plus a pop-up mystery that travels. Tanya lives in East Vancouver with her 2 children and her dog, Dr. Watson. She collects mystery and detective pulp fiction and loves film noir and tabletop games. Without further ado, please enjoy today's short story, The Four Suspects, from the Tuesday Club Murders by Agatha Christie.
I have chosen a book from my personal library of vintage mystery books, The Tuesday Club Murders by Agatha Christie. This book is a U.S. edition that was published in 1933, but was originally published as the title The 13 Problems in 1929 in the UK. I chose it because a favorite detective appears for the first time in this book, Miss Marple. In fact, Chapter 1 begins at Miss Marple's house with her nephew and his 4 friends visiting. They've decided to start a club. They're going to get together every week to discuss unsolved mysteries. It's pretty exciting. In fact, it's so exciting that they forget all about their elderly aunt, Miss Marple, being in the room. Let me see, how many are we? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We ought really to be 6. You have forgotten me, dear, said Miss Marple, smiling brightly. Joyce was slightly taken aback, but she concealed the fact quickly. That would be lovely, Miss Marple. I didn't think you would care to play. I think it would be very interesting, said Miss Marple, especially with so many clever gentlemen present. I am afraid I am not clever myself, but living all these years in St. Mary Mead does give one an insight into human nature. I am sure your cooperation will be very valuable, said Sir Henry courteously. Well, they get together every week, and each week they bring a different story. Those stories make up the 13 chapters in the Tuesday Club Murders. And of course, Miss Marple becomes a highly valued member. She goes on to be the character in 12 Agatha Christie books, plus, of course, many TV shows and movies. I'll be reading Chapter 9 of the Tuesday Club Murders, The 4 Suspects. But first, let me introduce the members of the club. This particular meeting takes place at the home of Colonel Bantry and his wife, Mrs. Bantry. Also present, his old friend, retired Commissioner of Scotland Yard, Sir Henry Clithering. As well, popular and beautiful actress Jane Hellier and the elderly Dr. Lloyd. Oh, and of course, Miss Marple. Who will solve the mystery of the 4 suspects? It is Sir Henry Clithering's turn to bring the mystery this week. A very curious case, a case where we believe murder to have been committed, but with no possible chance of ever proving it. Poison, I suppose, breathed Jane. Something untraceable. Dr. Lloyd moved restlessly, and Sir Henry shook his head. No, dear lady, I wish it were something of that kind. We have to deal with something much more prosaic. So prosaic, in fact, that there's no hope of bringing the deed home to its perpetrator. An old gentleman who fell downstairs and broke his neck. One of those regrettable accidents which happen every day. But what happened really? Who can say? Sir Henry shrugged his shoulders. A push from behind? A piece of cotton or string tied across the top of the stairs and carefully removed afterwards? That we shall never know. But you do think that it wasn't an accident. Now why? Asked the doctor. That's rather a long story, but yes, we're pretty sure. As I said, there's no chance of being able to bring the deed home to anyone. The evidence would be too flimsy. You see, there were 4 people who might have done the trick. One's guilty, but the other 3 are innocent. And unless the truth is found out, those 3 are going to remain under the terrible shadow of doubt. I think, said Mrs. Bantry, that you'd better tell us your long story. I needn't make it so very long after all, said Sir Henry. I can at any rate condense the beginning. That deals with a German secret society, the Schwarze Hand, a scheme of blackmail and terrorization. The thing started quite suddenly after the war and spread to an amazing extent. Numberless people were victimized by it. The authorities were not successful in coping with it, for its secrets were jealously guarded, and it was almost impossible to find anyone who could be induced to betray them. Nothing was much ever known about it in England, but in Germany it was having a most paralyzing effect. It was finally broken up and dispersed through the efforts of one man, a Dr. Rosen, who had at one time been very prominent in Secret Service work. He became a member, penetrated its inmost circle, and was, as I say, instrumental in bringing about its downfall. But he was, in consequence, a marked man, and it was deemed wise that he should leave Germany, at any rate for a time. He came to England, and we had letters about him from the police in Berlin. He came and had a personal interview with me. His point of view was both dispassionate and resigned. He had no doubts of what the future held for him. "They will get me, Sir Henry," he said. "Not a doubt of it." He was a big man with a very deep voice, with only a slight guttural intonation to tell of his nationality. "That is a foregone conclusion. It does not matter. I am prepared. I faced the risk when I undertook this business. I have done what I set out to do. The organization can never be gotten together again. But there are many members of it at liberty, and they will take the only revenge they can, my life. It is simply a question of time. But I am anxious that that time should be as long as possible." He spoke very simply, with a certain grandeur, which I could not but admire. I told him we would take all precautions, but he waved my words aside. "Someday, sooner or later, they will get me," he repeated. "When that day comes, do not distress yourself. You will, I have no doubt, have done all that is possible." He then proceeded to outline his plans, which were simple enough. He proposed to take a small cottage in the country where he could live quietly and go on with his work. In the end, he selected a village in Somerset, 7 miles from a railway station and singularly untouched by civilization. His household consisted of his niece Greta, a secretary, an old German servant who had served him faithfully for nearly 40 years, and an outside handyman and gardener who was born in the village. "The 4 suspects," said Dr. Lloyd softly. "Exactly, the 4 suspects. There is not much more to tell. Life went on peacefully for 5 months, and then the blow fell. Dr. Rosen fell down the stairs one morning and was found dead about half an hour later. At the time the accident must have taken place, Gertrude was in her kitchen with the door closed and heard nothing. So she says. Fräulein Greta was in the garden planting some bulbs. Again, so she says. The gardener Dobbs was in the small potting shed having his elevenses. So he says. And the secretary was out for a walk. And once more, there is only his own word for it. No one had an alibi. No one can corroborate anyone else's story. But one thing is certain. No one from outside could have done it, for a stranger in the little village would be noticed without fail. Both the back and the front doors were locked, each member of the household having their own key. So you see, it narrows down to these 4, and yet each one seems to be above suspicion. Greta, his own brother's child. Gertrude, with 40 years of faithful service. Dobbs, who has never been out of the village, and Charles Templeton, the secretary. Yes, said Colonel Bantry. What about him? He seems the suspicious person to my mind. What do you know about him? It is what I knew about him that put him completely out of court. At any rate at the time, said Sir Henry gravely. You see, Charles Templeton was one of my own men. Oh, said Colonel Bantry, considerably taken aback. Yes, I wanted to have someone on the spot, and at the same time, I didn't want to cause talk in the village. Rosen really needed a secretary. I put Templeton on the job. He's a gentleman, he speaks German fluently, and he's altogether a very able fellow. But then, which do you suspect? Asked Mrs. Bantry in a bewildered tone. They all seem so, well, impossible. Yes, so it appears. But you can look at the thing from another angle. Fräulein Greta was his niece and a very lovely girl, but the war has shown us time and again that brother can turn against sister, or father against son, and so on, and the loveliest and gentlest of young girls did some of the most amazing things. The same thing applies to Gertrude, and who knows what other forces might be at work in her case. A quarrel, perhaps, a growing resentment, all the more lasting because of the long, faithful years behind her. And Dobbs? Was he right outside it because he had no connection with the family? Money will do much. In some way, Dobbs might have been approached and bought. For one thing seems certain, some message or some order must have come from outside. Otherwise, why 5 months' immunity? No, the agents of the society must have been at work. Not yet sure of Rosen, they delayed till the betrayal had been traced to him beyond any possible doubt. And then, all doubt set aside, they must have sent their message to the spy within the gates. The message that said, "Kill." "How nasty," said Jane Hellier, and shuddered. But how did the message come? That was the point I tried to elucidate, the one hope of solving my problem. One of those 4 people must have been approached or communicated with in some way. There would be no delay. I knew that. As soon as the command came, it would be carried out. That was a peculiarity of the Schwarze Hand. I went into the question. Who had come to the cottage that morning? I eliminated nobody. Here is the list. He took an envelope from his pocket and selected a paper from its contents. The butcher, bringing some neck of mutton, investigated and found correct. The grocer's assistant, bringing a packet of corn flour, 2 pounds of sugar, a pound of butter, and a pound of coffee, also investigated and found correct. The postman, bringing 2 circulars for Fräulein Rosen, a local letter for Gertrude, 3 letters for Dr. Rosen, 1 with a foreign stamp, and 2 letters for Mr. Templeton, 1 also with a foreign stamp. Sir Henry paused and then took a sheaf of documents from the envelope. It may interest you to see these for yourself. They were handed me by the various people concerned or collected from the wastepaper basket. I need hardly say they've been tested by experts for invisible ink, etc. No excitement of that kind. Everyone crowded round to look. The catalogues were respectively from a nurseryman and from a prominent London fur establishment. The 2 bills addressed to Dr. Rosen were a local one for seeds for the garden and one from a London stationery firm. The letter addressed to him ran as follows. My dear Rosen, just back from Dr. Helmuth's baths, I saw Edgar Jackson the other day. He and Amos Perry have just come back from Tsingtao. In all honesty, I can't say I envy them the trip. Let me have news of you soon. As I said before, beware of a certain person. You know who I mean, though you don't agree. Yours, Georgina. Mr. Templeton's mail consisted of this bill, which, as you see, is an account rendered from his tailor and a letter from a friend in Germany, went on Sir Henry. The latter, unfortunately, he tore up while out on his walk. Finally, we have the letter received by Gertrude. Dear Mrs. Schwartz, we're hoping you will be able to come to the church social on Friday evening. The vicar says he hopes you will, one and all being welcome. The recipe for the ham was very good, and I thank you for it. Hoping as this finds you well and that we shall see you Friday, I remain, yours faithfully, Emma Green. Dr. Lloyd smiled a little over this, and so did Mrs. Bantry. I think the last letter can be put out of court, said Dr. Lloyd. I thought the same, said Sir Henry, but I took the precaution of verifying that there was a Mrs. Green and a church social. One can't be too careful, you know. That's what our friend Miss Marple always says Dr. Lloyd, smiling. You're lost in a daydream, Miss Marple. What are you thinking out? Miss Marple gave a start. So stupid of me, she said. I was just wondering why the word honesty in Dr. Rosen's letter was spelt with a capital H. Mrs. Bantry picked it up. So it is, she said. Oh, yes, dear, said Miss Marple. I thought you'd notice. There's a definite warning in that letter, said Colonel Bantry. That's the first thing caught my attention. I noticed more than you'd think. Yes, a definite warning. Against whom? There's rather a curious point about that letter, said Sir Henry. According to Templeton, Dr. Rosen opened up the letter at breakfast and tossed it across to him, saying he didn't know who the fellow was from Adam. But it wasn't a fellow, said Jane Hellier. It was signed Georgina. It's difficult to say which it is, said Dr. Lloyd. It might be Georgie, but it certainly looks more like Georgina. Only it strikes me that the writing is a man's. You know, that's interesting, said Colonel Bantry. His tossing it across the table like that and pretending he knew nothing about it. Wanted to watch somebody's face. Whose face? The girl's or the man's? Or even the cook's, suggested Mrs. Bantry. She might have been in the room bringing in the breakfast. But what I don't see is, it's most peculiar. She frowned over the letter. Miss Marple drew closer to her. Miss Marple's finger went out and touched the sheet of paper. They murmured together. But why did the secretary tear up the other letter? Asked Jane Hellier suddenly. It seems odd. Why should he have letters from Germany? Although, of course, if he's above suspicion, as you say. But Sir Henry didn't say that, said Miss Marple, quickly looking up from her murmured conference with Mrs. Bantry. He said 4 suspects, so that shows that he includes Mr. Templeton. I'm right, am I not, Sir Henry? Yes, Miss Marple. I have learned one thing through bitter experience. Never say to yourself that anyone is above suspicion. I gave you reasons just now why 3 of these people might after all be guilty, unlikely as it seemed. I did not at that time apply the same process to Charles Templeton. But I came to it at last through pursuing the rule I have just mentioned. And I was forced to recognize this, that every army and every navy and every police force has a certain number of traitors within its ranks, much as we hate to admit the idea. And I examined dispassionately the case against Charles Templeton. I asked myself very much the same questions as Miss Hellier has just asked. Why should he alone of all the house not be able to produce the letter he had received? A letter, moreover, with a German stamp on it. Why should he have letters from Germany? The last question was an innocent one, and I actually put it to him. His reply came simply enough. His mother's sister was married to a German. The letter had been from a German girl cousin. So I learned something I did not know before, that Charles Templeton had relations with people in Germany. And that put him definitely on the list of suspects, very much so. He is my own man, a lad I have always liked and trusted, but in common justice and fairness, I must admit that he heads that list. But there it is. I do not know, and in all probability I shall never know. It is not a question of punishing a murderer. It is a question that to me seems 100 times more important. It is the blighting, perhaps, of an honorable man's whole career because of suspicion, a suspicion that I dare not disregard. Miss Marple coughed and said gently, Then, Sir Henry, if I understand you rightly, it is this young Mr. Templeton only who is so much on your mind? Yes, in a sense. It should in theory be the same for all 4, but that is not actually the case. Dobbs, for instance. Suspicion may attach to him in my mind, but it will not actually affect his career. Nobody in the village has ever had any idea that old Dr. Rosen's death was anything but an accident. Gertrude is slightly more affected. It must make, for instance, a difference in Fräulein Rosen's attitude towards her. But that possibly is not of great importance to her. As for Greta Rosen, well, here we come to the crux of the matter. Greta is a very pretty girl, and Charles Templeton is a good-looking young man, and for 5 months they were thrown together with no outer distractions. The inevitable happened. They fell in love with each other, even if they did not come to the point of admitting the fact in words. And then the catastrophe happens. It is 3 months ago now, and a day or 2 after I returned, Greta Rosen came to see me. She had sold the cottage and was returning to Germany, having finally settled up her uncle's affairs. She came to me personally, although she knew I had retired because it was really about a personal matter she wanted to see me. She beat about the bush a little, but at last it all came out. What did I think? That letter with the German stamp. She had worried about it and worried about it. The one Charles had torn up. Was it all right? Surely it must be all right. Of course she believed his story, but oh, if she only knew, if she knew for certain. You see, the same feeling, the wish to trust, but the horrible lurking suspicion, thrust resolutely to the back of the mind, but persisting nevertheless. I spoke to her with absolute frankness and asked her to do the same. I asked her whether she had been on the point of caring for Charles, and he for her. I think so, she said. Oh yes, I know it was so. We were so happy. Every day passed so contentedly. We both knew. There was no hurry. There was all the time in the world. Someday he would tell me he loved me, and I should tell him that I too. But you can guess. And now it has all changed. A black cloud has come between us. We are constrained when we meet. We do not know what to say. It is perhaps the same with him as with me. We are each saying to ourselves, if I were sure. That is why, Sir Henry, I beg of you to say to me, you may be sure, whoever killed your uncle, it was not Charles Templeton. Say it to me. I beg. And damn it all, cried Sir Henry, bringing down his fist with a bang on the table. I couldn't say it to her. They'll drift farther and farther apart, those two, with suspicion like a ghost between them. He leaned back in his chair. His face looked tired and gray. He shook his head once or twice despondently. And there's nothing more can be done unless... He sat up straight again, and a tiny whimsical smile crossed his face. Unless Miss Marple can help us. Can't you, Miss Marple? I have a feeling that letter might be in your line, you know, the one about the church social. Doesn't it remind you of something or someone that makes everything perfectly plain? Can't you do something to help two helpless young people who want to be happy? Behind the whimsicality, there was something earnest in his appeal. He had come to think very highly of the mental powers of this frail, old-fashioned lady. He looked across at her with something very like hope in his eyes. Miss Marple coughed and smoothed her lace. It does remind me a little of Annie Pulteney, she admitted. Of course, the letter is perfectly plain, both to Mrs. Bantry and myself. I don't mean the church social letter, but the other one. You living so much in London and not being a gardener, Sir Henry, would not have been likely to notice. Eh? Said Sir Henry. Notice what? Mrs. Bantry reached out a hand and selected a catalogue. She opened it and read aloud with gusto. Dr. Helma's Spath, pure lilac, a wonderfully fine flower carried on exceptionally long and stiff stem. Edgar Jackson, beautifully shaped chrysanthemum-like flower of a distinct brick red color. Amos Perry, brilliant red, highly decorative. Tsingtao, brilliant orange red, showy garden plant and lasting cut flower. Honesty, with a capital H, you remember, murmured Miss Marple. Honesty, rose and white shades, enormous, perfect-shaped flower. Mrs. Bantry flung down the catalogue and said with immense, explosive force, Dahlias, they're all dahlias. And their initial letters spell death, explained Miss Marple. But the letter came to Dr. Rosen himself, objected Sir Henry. That was the clever part of it, said Miss Marple. That and the warning in it. What would he do, getting a letter from someone he didn't know, full of names he didn't know? Why, of course, toss it over to his secretary. Then, after all... Oh, no, said Miss Marple, not the secretary. Why, that's what makes it so perfectly clear that it wasn't him. He'd never have let that letter be found if so. And equally, he'd never have destroyed a letter to himself with a German stamp on it. Really, his innocence is, if you'll allow me to use the word, just shining. Then who? Well, it seems almost certain as anything can be in this world. There was another person at that breakfast table, and she would, quite naturally under the circumstances, put out her hand for the letter and read it. And that would be that. You remember that she got a gardening catalogue by the same post. Greta Rosen, said Sir Henry slowly. Then her visit to me... Gentlemen never see through these things, said Miss Marple. I've no doubt there was a barrier between them. The young man felt a sudden, inexplicable repulsion. He suspected purely through instinct and couldn't hide the suspicion. And I really think that the girl's visit to you was just pure spite. She was safe enough, really, but she just went out of her way to fix your suspicions definitely on poor Mr. Templeton. You weren't nearly so sure about him until after her visit. I'm sure it was nothing that she said, began Sir Henry. Gentlemen, said Miss Marple calmly, never see through these things. And that girl, he stopped, she commits a cold-blooded murder and gets off scot-free. Oh, no, Sir Henry, said Miss Marple, not scot-free. Neither you nor I believe that. Greta Rosen will not escape punishment. To begin with, she must be in with a very dangerous set of people, blackmailers and terrorists, associates who will do her no good and will probably bring her to a miserable end. And Mr. Templeton, who I dare say will marry that German cousin, his tearing up her letter looks, well, it looks suspicious, using the word in quite a different sense from the one we've been using all the evening. A little as though he were afraid of the other girl noticing or asking to see it. Yes, I think there must have been some little romance there. And then there's Dobbs, though, as you say, I dare say it won't matter much to him. His 11s are probably all he thinks about. And then there's that poor old Gertrude. I felt much more sorry for her than for Mr. Templeton, who is young and good-looking and evidently a favorite with the ladies. You will write to her, won't you, Sir Henry, and just tell her that her innocence is established beyond doubt? Her dear old boss dead, and she no doubt brooding and feeling herself suspected of, oh, it won't bear thinking about. I will write, Miss Marple, said Sir Henry. He looked at her curiously. You know, I shall never quite understand you. Your outlook is always a different one from what I expect. My outlook, I am afraid, is a very petty one, said Miss Marple humbly. I hardly ever go out of St. Mary Mead. And yet you have solved what may be called an international mystery, said Sir Henry. For you have solved it. I am convinced of that. Miss Marple blushed, then bridled a little. I was, I think, well educated for the standard of my day. My sister and I had a German governess, a Fräulein. She taught us the language of flowers, a forgotten study nowadays, but most charming. A yellow tulip, for instance, means hopeless love, while a China aster means I die of jealousy at your feet. That letter was signed Georgina, which I seem to remember as Dahlia in German, and that, of course, made the whole thing perfectly clear. I wish I could remember the meaning of Dahlia, but alas, that eludes me. My memory is not what it was. At any rate, it didn't mean death. No, indeed. Horrible, is it not? There are very sad things in the world. There are, said Mrs. Bantry with a sigh. It's lucky one has flowers and one's friends. She puts us last, you observe, said Dr. Lloyd. A man used to send me purple orchids every night to the theater, said Jane dreamily. I await your favors. That's what that means, said Miss Marple brightly. Sir Henry gave a peculiar sort of cough and turned his head away. Miss Marple gave a sudden exclamation. I've remembered. Dahlias means treachery and misrepresentation. Wonderful, said Sir Henry. Absolutely wonderful.